I think it is absolutely critical that various forces in global society must gather. In this case, the interfaith religious community have gathered to append themselves to the G20. And it is done in recognition of the fact that the world is in a series of intersecting crises. And if we don't arrest those crises, we may, as a world, face an existential crisis in which climate overruns us and we kill ourselves with conflict. And so every organized sector of global society, including the religious, must really understand that we are at the last throw of the dice. Now is the time for all hands on deck, and this is the time to make sure that we force our global leaders who make the decisions, who control the finances, who set policy, who control implementation, that they must know that we are holding them accountable, and they must know that there is no place to hide, that they must do the right thing. And the reason that I think we've got to speak stridently, passionately, and compellingly is because those global leaders are fighting in their own countries populist battles. They are fighting to win the fear of their communities by exploiting the ignorance of communities. And so the religious community has to not only advocate and lobby those global leaders, but it must at the same time tend to the flocks, make sure that ordinary people are not left in ignorance, that their fears are subsided, and that they again begin to think and act with their hopes. When we expect much of the religious communities and the interfaith community, we must really do so with enough humility. Because the question that I posed at this conference is whether the religious communities are the doctors or the patients. Are they the ones who can solve the problems, or are they themselves infected with various toxins? Because we have religious communities who find ways to excuse terror. We have religious communities who are apologists for genocide. We have religious communities that really is a fig leaf for gun violence, who support Hindutva, and all of those kind of things. So there is a double-edged sword that we must fight with. The one edge of the sword must first cut inward, get the toxins out of us, so that we can become a clear moral voice without our contradictions, and the other edge must cut outwards in order to persuade global leaders that they need to reform. And so, when I say that the religious community must pick up the cudgels, I'm very aware that they need self-reform in order to reform externally. Because a lot of the crises that we're having, human trafficking, children that are abused and massacred, wars that are fought, the enslavement of people, the unleashing of isms and phobias against those who are different, whether it's racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, misogyny particularly, all of those things, xenophobia, all of those things will have to be fought, but we need to make sure that we are not complicit in it ourselves. And so what I think the expectation of the world is for religion to step up, but in a self-reformed way as well. So a lot of them who are doctors are also pastoral doctors. They look after their own flock. They work on the basis of individual change within the members of their flock. how each person in their flock can live sustainable lives, can live lives that embrace differences, particularly from other people with other faiths, with other colors, with other languages and other cultures. They've got to learn and teach each one of their flock those essential tools that are important. The second one is that their institution as a church must be sustainable, must be embracing. The third one is that they've got to transcend. A lot of the religious activists are single issue activists. They focus on children, and it's absolutely critical. They focus on women, absolutely critical. They focus on racism, absolutely critical. And so we can go on with all the single issues. But the sum of the single issues is necessary but not sufficient. They've also got to work on the big picture. So what I say in this conference is that we are all very good at mopping up the water, whether it is the water that is spilling on women, on children, on trafficking, on racism and all of those kinds of things. It's very important. But they've got to take a break from the mopping in order to turn off the tap that produces the water. And therefore, the point is, we must understand that the crises we're dealing with are embedded in the structures of society and the structures of global institutions like the World Bank, like the IMF, like the United Nations, like the Security Council, and all the other organizations. You see, those other organizations are the taps from which the crises flow. And they were formed after World War I and World War II. And they were a way to mediate between nations, because essentially the conflicts that existed were between nations. However, all the crises that we're dealing with are transnational crises. International governance is not sufficient to deal with transnational crises, whether it is COVID-19 and other pandemics, whether it is trafficking across borders, whether it is conflict. It can't be up to one country to solve a conflict. And therefore you've got to change the architecture of the governance of the world from international governance to global governance. Every country must cede enough of its sovereignty so that global solutions can be found to transnational countries. It must be a world in which there must be an end to impunity. We've got to have the enforcement mechanisms and the accountability mechanisms over a West that has industrialized to such an extent that their emissions have caused a lake in Africa to disappear, have caused desertification to run wild in Africa, have caused enormous poverty because when a lake disappears, people are displaced and they look for food elsewhere, have caused the potential for conflict because when Africa can give you no food, you go to Europe. And when you are in Europe and you are mistreated, you become angry. And so the point that I'm making is that this is the intricate system of global governance that we must get right. So the first thing is, what we need to do is to find an accountability mechanism. And if it doesn't reside in a government, then I think we must build that capacity amongst the ordinary people of a society that they understand that. I also think that knowledge is the very important thing in an age that is called post-truth. We can't have technology driving a post-truth world and then think that it is easy to counteract ignorance and fear with knowledge, because knowledge will have no platform from which to be provided. And so we need to harness that same mechanism that can distort truth. We need to harness that same mechanism for AI, for Google, for this, for that, in order for us to be able to have inbuilt verification so that we can combat ignorance with a working knowledge and truth about what is to be done. And then I think we've got to be able to add to our religious morality a political strategy. Because so often the idea of being right is sufficient for us. But it's not enough to be right. You've got to be effective. And that is where politics meets morality, where principle meets strategy. And so what we need is to develop a capacity for strategy amongst the religious leaders, amongst the leaders of the third economy, civil society, and so forth, so that they have the instrumentation to speak truth to power, not just the commitment. At the personal level, I have an absolute commitment to the vision of leaving no one behind. I have a fear that we are trying to implement a vision in which there are structural and systemic causes for people being left behind. And that's the issue of the mop and the tap. If the structural causes are designed to leave people behind, then we must continue to do our duty to mop up and to save people from absolute desolation. We've got to do that and intervene with our humanitarian aid and all of those kind of things. But we must know that that aid is like the finger in the dike. It is not going to be sufficient unless we have structural change. And so I'm asking for, when I grew up in apartheid South Africa and we fought apartheid, and as religious activists, we followed Archbishop Tutu and others in designing for all our faiths a liberation theology, in which theology took the fight to apartheid. Priests were in the forefront of that fight. They were jailed, they were killed, assassinated, exiled. I'm not saying that we should relive that nostalgia. What I'm asking is, what is the current iteration? How do we upgrade the app so that we can produce the theology to confront the structures while ministering to our flock and giving pastoral care to every individual and healing our communities? What is the equivalent of the liberation theologian today? I don't have the answers, but that's what we need if religion is to be effective and if we are going to truly not leave anyone behind.
It's quite the call to courage, too.
And that's the point that I'm making. The point that I made inside was, I have no doubt that the religious community has moral clarity. They know what is right and they know what is wrong. What I fear is that we don't always have moral courage to do what is right, to confront who needs to be confronted, and to be able to truly lead people in we called it in South Africa, learning from Gandhi, Archbishop Tutu, Nelson Mandela, we called it militant nonviolence. How? Because the crises are becoming existential and it needs bold measures and bold leadership.